Thank you so much for coming. My name is Natalia Panovich, and I'm a lecturer in the Sustainable Built Environments program here. And I would like to introduce our guest speaker today, Theo Wickland. He's presidential postdoctoral fellow in urban studies in the School of Geography here at the University of Arizona. He's also an academic affiliate at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University. Theo received his PhD in urban planning from the UCLA, and his research looks at land relations of modernity, coloniality, and abundant futures. His research is driven by his desire to promote justice, diversity, and abundant possibility in, of, and through transportation. So thank you so much for coming, and you can take it away from here if the technology allows us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Natalia. Let's see. Can I share my screen? Yes. Thank you to the person who enabled the screen sharing. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see my presentation.
Yes, we can see it.
Sorry, I'm having a little screen. Okay. So, thanks. Yeah, as Nat said, I'm Theo Wickland. I'm a presidential postdoctoral fellow in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment. And thank you for having me here today, and thank you also all for coming to my talk. Today I'm going to talk about automobile supremacism, which is a bit of a different way of thinking about transportation than we often hear about in fields like planning. And I definitely welcome your feedback and questions and want to have a conversation with you about it, because these are ideas that I am trying out and continuing to develop. And so I'd love to strengthen them as I continue to work with them. I will just mention that there are a couple images in the presentation that could be disturbing to some people. They're not too graphic, but I do want to just preface that. Speaking of images, here's a picture of the Katy Freeway in Houston, Texas, which is 26 lanes wide, including frontage roads, and still has traffic jams. And I think it's an interesting example of dominations of land, space, and also ways of dominating ideas of travel. And so maybe with that, a framework to start thinking about the presentation. So in today's talk, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about where automobility, the car system, comes from, before talking about ways of understanding automobility as a structure of power, and then spend a bit of time on the peculiar quality of the auto system in maximizing rather than minimizing resource consumption. Moving on, I'll talk about enforcing supremacist hierarchies, ways in which automobility is a site for the enforcement of systemic supremacisms, from race to man over nature. And then demanding collective subsidies, even from people who do not have cars. And then finally, against the doom and gloom from the prior parts of the presentation, think a bit about transformative possibilities. So first, let's think a bit about genealogies. I think that we can learn a lot about anything by understanding where it comes from, right? What are the key conditions and contexts in which anything developed? And automobility is no exception. So to begin, I'd like to think about what are some of the dominant ideas and conceptions of mobility among groups who first developed the automobile. Move this so that you can see better. Okay. So I think John Gast's American Progress aptly depicts many of these ideas from the late 19th century. So this was a time where the context of European exploration, conquest, and colonialism worldwide was very relevant, as well as romanticisms of the frontier, linear transportation, and civilizational supremacism, as well as ideas of entitlement to land and resources. Speaking of entitlement to resources, this is an early oil field in Pennsylvania in the late 1800s. And along with other material extractivisms like coal mining, steelworks, and so forth, this was another important ingredient to the development of automobility. Moving a little bit closer to home for us here in Tucson, this is a picture of Congress Street in downtown Tucson in 1913 as it was being paved. And we see an automobile in the foreground and horse-drawn vehicles in the background. And this early integration of the automobile into city streets foreshadowed a later complete takeover, right? So at the frontier of the American West, right, in subway colonial development, and with the support of that extractivist resource provision. Part of what would make that takeover possible was the application of mass production. So this is a moving assembly line at the Ford plant in Highland Park, Michigan in 1913. And that's the same year as the image from downtown Tucson that I just showed you. And here we see the logic of scalar replication, right? A single solution, which is being produced repeatedly to be deployed across space as a solution to, in this case, people's mobility problems. And that industrial scale production actually relies on a certain dehumanization. So here we see that the factory is also the production of the individual atomized worker. And they're doing repetitive work that is divorced from land and also minimizing social interaction. And that's also an important part of the logics and values that went into the early development of automobility. And so to think about this a little bit more, I'd like to share a film clip with you. That was actually a film screened at the GM Futurama Pavilion in the 1939 to 1940 New York World's Fair. Some of you may have heard of Futurama. Some of you may have even seen this film. The overall film is almost 30 minutes long, but I've cut clips to about 5 minutes to share with you. And it kind of articulates a modernist vision of a future America looking forward to 1960. Centering the automobile. And it reveals a lot of key ideas relevant to the early development of automobility. So let me hopefully.
Can you answer that? So this is not hearing anything, just
okay. And I hope that we can make that is audible to everyone.
Continued for centuries. Some far distant view, with its promise of the unseen and its promise of the unknown, has forever fathered the impulse to seek for new things in new places, new horizons, roads for men to go places.
So we see colonial entitlement, patriarchy, the idea of reaching a destination, ideas of progress, linear progress, and transportation as part of
The accelerating rate of men's progress in all fields of endeavor has paralleled closely our progress in the freedom of movement from place to place. New things to do and new ways to do them. Telephone, electric lights, automobiles, aircraft, all are symbols of better living. New places to go and new means of getting there.
And we see that ideas very intertwined.
With a growing appreciation of the wisdom of applying the road tax monies to the road building program for which they were designed, highway development is going on at a rapidly increasing pace.
And so automobility is in this way understood as the core part of progress. The film now is going to go looking toward the future, 1960.
And now we have arrived in this wonder world of 1960. Here are the farm roads of the community. They have been improved and made to flow into great motorways. This superb one-direction highway, with its 7 lanes accommodating traffic at designated speeds of 50, 75, and 100 miles an hour, is engineered for easy grades and for speed with safety. Cars from the farm roads and feeder lanes join the motorway traffic at the same speed as cars traveling in the lane they enter. Here is a highway intersection. Highway engineering at its most spectacular. Traffic may move safely and easily without loss of speed. By means of the ramp loops, cars may make right and left turns at rates of speed up to 50 miles per hour. Elevated and depressed are the turning off lanes. There is no interference from the straight ahead traffic in the higher speed lanes. The motorist of 1960 finds this intersection safe and efficient. The motorway continues through the mountains. Without tedious travel, the advantages of living in a small town are within easy reach, bringing the people who live there into closer relations with all the world around. Over space, man has begun to win victory. Space living, space for working, space for pay, all available for more people than ever before. Over a spectacular suspension bridge, the motorway enters a large city, spanning the navigable river on which it is situated and forming a gateway to the city. A feature of this bridge is the elimination of congestion and the elimination of interference from all the various converging motorways and from all the feeder roads. On all express city thoroughfares, the rights of way have been so rooted as to displace outmoded business sections and undesirable slum areas whenever possible. Man continually strives to replace the old with the new.
So looking back at this from, today in 2024, maybe is not obvious, but it was really a soaring, inspirational vision of the future, right? That people went and paid to go to the Futurama Pavilion at the World's Fair in 1939 and 1940 to watch this video and also to look at the diorama. And there is a lot of engagement and a lot of faith, really, with technical engineering, as well as an emphasis on speed, independence, and really an awe in this possible future. I heard in the video celebrations of man's conquest of space, right? Man's conquest of space, including displacement of undesirable slum areas. If you maybe heard, there was one moment at which the narrator talked about a superb One Direction highway, right? This One Direction highway, which I think is really a metaphor of inevitability, both in the narrative for modernization, as well as the development of automobility, as well as the faith that the car is going to take you to your destination. And as you probably know, the modernists got more or less what they wanted. We are living their automobilist dream. And the ubiquity of automobility hasn't always gone quite as envisioned, which we've seen, for example, in various cultural meanings and appropriations that go beyond early automobilist dreams, some of which they likely would not have appreciated. For example, as marginalized groups might appropriate automobility in ways that are less linear, less destination focused, and that reproduce different values than those of automobilist early boosters, but they're still doing so within a supremacist structure. And I understand that supremacist structure through more than human power relations. More than human, meaning that the agents conveying and responding to power include both humans and non-humans, like vehicles and materials. Automobility is not just a system for getting around. It's a complex set of more than human relationships that are all relations of power. As we see in auto-oriented spaces, the transformation of space to optimize it for the car enforces a power relation that is hostile to people walking. And sometimes this can go to extremes. Like, for example, a restaurant, a fast food restaurant that has a drive-through open late, but you're only allowed to go to the drive-through if you have a car. So in that kind of situation, you actually need a car to be able to get food. But of course, these power relations don't only affect people who drive. Spaces like this induce demand for cars because it's necessary to do many things. You have to have a car to do almost anything here. And then if you do have a car, maybe you're sitting in a car all day, you end up being exhausted, but you have hardly spent any calories because you've just been sitting down. And the car and this sort of auto-oriented spaces make people feel impotent, because if you're used to being in a car and driving around all the time, you're not used to going a far distance, and the space doesn't look like doesn't look inviting to walking a far distance. So you feel like to even go a few miles, you need an industrial machine. And those power relations come vividly into view in instances like motor vehicle crashes, where drivers imagine power to pursue the ideal of automobility, right, quickly reaching a destination, is confronted by the power of vehicles and the material power of infrastructure and land, along with other drivers. And sometimes that confrontation is a reminder that automobility is not omnipotent. Yet the more than human power relations of automobility are amplified by its vast scale. So from early industrial production in the United States, automobile universalism has spread worldwide. For example, this is a Hutong in Beijing, China, which is a traditional neighborhood in terms of its transportation orientation. It's really around walking and biking, but it's really a place that emphasizes community relations. And this sort of neighborhood has been systemically destroyed over the past few decades to make way for auto-oriented modernist development. And this is really the logic of the car factory that we saw earlier, right? The replication of a universal solution across space, copied and pasted across space. And all that replication requires replication of resource extraction, forging a particular set of power relations with land, ecosystems, and racialized labor, as we can see in this rubber plantation in Sumatra, required to produce tires, and in also in other almost innumerable examples of resource extraction shaping more than human power dynamics in supremacist ways. And all that resource extraction is necessary to maximize resource consumption. If you were designing a transportation system to maximize resource consumption, you would have a hard time coming up with a system that consumed more resources than automobility. This is not a coincidence. The system is optimized to maximize consumption because that maximizes concentrated capital accumulation, as well as the projection of colonial power across space. Automobility, in its current incarnation at least, emphasizes individual vehicle ownership. So to support all that consumption, you need a lot of vehicles that all have to be produced, transported, and purchased. And once they're purchased, they have to be stored, because individual ownership means that they're sitting around unused almost all of the time. Anytime their owners are working, shopping, eating, sleeping, watching TV, visiting friends, or doing anything other than driving. And so that requires land, materials, and things like labor and energy for construction, so on and so forth. But cars are driven once in a while, and for that they need fuel. Fuel is a resource, which also requires money, to the point where gas prices are a leading indicator of consumer sentiment and voting intention in places like the United States. Automobility shapes politics, and that's true around the world, as in the case of this 50-lane traffic jam at the end of China's 2015 Golden Week holiday in Liulihe, 35 miles south of Beijing, where over 125,000 cars entered Beijing in one single day. The fossil fuel consumption that goes in these cars is attested by the smoggy air, but we also see the immense expanse of paved space and the sheer number of cars attesting to that resource consumption. And nor is resource consumption addressed by electrification, which just moves the problem around. This is the Salar de Atacama in Chile, where we see vast amounts of water usage, theft of indigenous land, and violent extraction of culturally meaningful agents from their life worlds in order to extract lithium for car batteries, which of course is also a reproduction of systemic supremacist hierarchies. Just like for fossil fuels, where nations like America are still thieving indigenous lands to build devastating pipelines, even in the face of vociferous protests. And in places like the United States, automobility is a platform for targeting disfavored groups, excuse me. Black drivers like Taeyeon Lee are disproportionately stopped by police. Taeyeon was stopped in Louisville in 2018 for allegedly making a wide turn, pulled from his car, frisked, handcuffs, asked why he was being negative. The citation was later dismissed. But automobility interacts with all sorts of supremacist hierarchies, including gender. So it universalizes masculinist logics of speed and conquest. which we can see, I think, especially at moments like rush hour, which I think of rush hour as toxic masculinity hour. This guy is in a moment of road rage. He tried to hit another car with a pipe and then came after the driver of a third car who was filming him attacking the prior car. I think road rage is actually people being dominated by their cars as they sit in traffic and are impotent and frustrated because they can't take advantage of their powerful machine. Similarly, cars also reinforce economic inequalities, like who can afford cars, who's indebted by them, and that further enforces other supremacisms aligned with wealth, like race, gender, and so forth. But automobility also creates its own supremacisms, like the supremacy of the car over other modes of travel. This memorial to Anita Kerman, who was killed in Boston in 2015, is a reminder that bicycling is dangerous principally because bicyclists get hit by cars. And anyone traveling amid automobility by any means other than a car has to be subservient, like how people walking need to follow logics of traffic signals that are based on automobiles, like pushing a button to cross the street, or like encountering all sorts of what I will call, in theory language, automobile universalist semiotics, like signs that apply only to cars, because cars are normativity. Like whiteness, they are the particular masquerading as the universal. So of course, signs in public space imply that only people in cars are worth recognizing or talking to. Supremacist hierarchies extend further, like infrastructure that levels the earth and tells a story of the supremacy of man over nature, or like infrastructures that are cited in a way that target subaltern groups, as envisioned in the Futurama exhibit, like this expressway that displaced my mother's immediate family on the south side of Chicago, not at all coincidentally with the fact that they're Black. Even transportation design review and budget prioritization processes enforce supremacist hierarchies. They claim to be neutral, but objectivity is a lie. This is a public meeting for a redesign of Polk Street in San Francisco, where I used to live. And you can probably see from this picture, although it's a little blurry, that whose voices were heard and listened to were not actually representative of all the people who use the street, but their voices drove the project's outcome. And none of that is innocent, and none of that is coincidental. Along with all of that enforcing of hierarchies, automobility also demands collective subsidies. That means you pay even if you don't have a car or if you choose not to drive one. So if you go to the store without driving, you may have to travel across an ugly, barren, soul-crushing parking lot. And to add injury to insult, the cost of the parking lot is bundled into the cost of the food. So the prices you pay for food are higher because of the parking lot, and eating costs more because of automobility. You pay for roads, whether you use them or not. And governments also use our tax dollars to subsidize automakers, as well as the companies that produce the fuels that cars run on. And then those cars built by subsidized automakers running on subsidized fuels on subsidized roads cause a ton of collateral damage. The risk of death and the ubiquity of death by automobile are also tributes that we pay in support of automobility. Automobiles pillage the commons with noise, waste heat, and toxins, like the air pollution from these simmering vehicles that then harms the health of everyone, even those without cars, and of course, also reinforces supremacist hierarchies. And even when hierarchies, like the attempted hierarchy of man over nature, fail, we still pay collective subsidies. As with the oil spilled by the Deepwater Horizon in 2020, generations will have to deal with the aftermath and after effects of automobility. And that subsidy comes from non-humans too, as automobility is a significant factor, among others, contributing to climate change and climate migration, and also contributes to the individualism that erodes empathy and understands problems as atomized rather than interrelated. So effortful migrations and futile responses to them are also tithes to automobility. And all of this, of course, enforces supremacist hierarchies. But if the pro-car modernists were able to transform the world per their vision, we also have the ability to spur transformation in spite of the apparent hegemony of automobility. As with these direct action modifications, transforming street space to be more than just a place for automobiles to dominate. On the left panel, we have a little free library, right? Activating public space, making it a resource for anyone who's there walking through that space. Or in the second panel, we have community members painting a Black Lives Matter mural on a street in DC in 2020. And the third panel, these are guerrilla speed bumps that neighbors have installed on their roads to slow down cars and reduce the risk of crashes. And in the fourth panel, this is actually an unauthorized crosswalk that folks painted on Jackson Street in San Francisco to make people feel like they actually have a right to cross the street. We also can think of maybe incremental repurposing of automobile infrastructure, as with this design to turn a parking garage into a apartment. Or we can think more broadly about places like Polk Street, which I mentioned earlier. So this is the street prior to the redesign, and we see that the space of the street is really allocated broadly to cars. And the city of San Francisco proposed a redesign that I think was really, really incremental and not at all imaginative. And I thought it would be good for them to propose something more like this, right? Where we could daylight the creek that had actually been turned into a storm sewer, make it actually really safe to bike there, make it a pleasant place to walk and hang out, have a lot of green space in a neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of green space. But it wasn't to be. The city actually ended up watering down their proposed design to something even less inspirational, but I think we can do much better. And I think even temporary animations are transformative, like this block party. And minor infrastructure tweaks can tell different stories about relations among people and non-humans, like permeable pavers that separate us a bit less from the land. And some interventions that might not obviously be about transportation can still transform the way we move and also the way that we think about that movement. This is a community garden in the Woonasquatucket River Greenway, run by Native Green, an indigenous environmental organization that I worked with when I was in Providence. And we can also think of examples from elsewhere that I think suggest even more transformative, even more radical possibilities. These are some images of a road in Anaho on Nukuhiva in French Polynesia or Whenua-Ma'ohe. And this may look like a trail. I argue it is actually a road. So this is a road that has been here for centuries or maybe even over 1,000 years. And the people who live in Anaho maintain this road. And they maintain this road according to their own standards. They are not replicating universal standards or ideas about what a road has to be or how wide it has to be or what vehicles have to run on it. And when they are maintaining the road, they're not just maintaining the access that they need between their village and the rest of the island. They're also communing with their ancestors who first built the road, right? So it's meaningful in a lot of ways. And it meets their local needs without making the area unduly accessible to tourists, which actually maintains a lot of their community structure. Or this bamboo bridge built by villagers in Bangladesh that meets their needs and is meaningful because the whole village built it together, including the people who cooked a collective meal that everyone had afterwards. So transportation can include vehicles for changing our relationships to community and land and place, as well as vehicles to get us to a physical destination. And I think for those of us who work in research or who are interested in research, we can also do transportation analyses in new ways, like through the method of causal layered analysis from future studies. Causal layered analysis structures an analysis of the causes of problems into layers, identifying the first layer as the litany, right? This is like the official public description of an issue. So that might be newspaper headlines like, there's a lot of traffic. The next layer below the litany are the systemic causes. So that's the layer of social analysis, short-term history. This is often a lot of policy reports and planning documents go in there. So you might see a policy report on a need to invest in more infrastructure, or maybe a plan describing how we're going to develop alternatives to the car. But we can still go further. The next layer is the layer of worldview, right? Analyses of discourse, culture, values, and knowledge. And so at this level, we might see like an academic article that says that actually building more roads causes more traffic. Or we might see a community organization working to educate people on different ways of moving around or different ways that they can transform their neighborhoods. And then the lowest level is the level of myth and metaphor. This is the level of unconscious deep stories. And this is actually also the level of inner transformation. So this might be, for example, the realization that I don't actually need to go to the store and buy anything. Maybe I'm fine right here. I don't have to get into my car. I'm good as I am. Like anything else, causal layered analysis is a metaphor. My question is, if we need to transform ourselves to transform transportation, how might we go about that? Thank you very much.
And I would love your questions and comments. Questions in the room or on Zoom also? Yes, please.
You talked about like changing people's personal views about autonomy. Do you think that starts with changing the infrastructure itself, or do you think you have to actually change the view?
Yeah, thank you. If those of you on Zoom couldn't hear, the question was about changing views. And do we have to change the infrastructure to change the views, or change the views to change the infrastructure? And I think it is actually, you point to a really good phenomenon, which is that there is a chicken and egg kind of dynamic there. And so you kind of have to do both at the same time. You kind of have to go back and forth. You know, you can convince small groups of people to maybe think differently, or to take a choice, take a chance on being creative or being imaginative. And then through that, you can get buy-in to adjust infrastructure a little bit. And then as infrastructure changes, then people start thinking differently. And then it becomes possible to, you know, get a larger group of people to expand their imaginations further. And, you know, we see this in all sorts of real life examples, like in Tucson, for example. The city has been investing a lot in more bicycle infrastructure. And that's only possible because it's earlier investments in bicycle infrastructure. People were like, okay, that's not too bad. Or I think it's actually good for these people to be able to like get around in other ways. Or maybe some other drivers are like, oh, good, they're out of my way. They're in their own lane, or they're on their own thing. So there's all sorts of ways in which that reinforces. But I think one of the things that is underappreciated is how much the infrastructure that we move through actually changes the way that we think, and the way that we value, and the way that we imagine. Yes.
So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what do you think is going on with people's preferences? So aesthetically, you know, like more walkable space,
Yeah.
it's going to be aesthetically preferable for
Mhm.
most people. But what do you think about when you want to actually ask people, you know, do you actually want this to be your road, your city, your neighborhood?
Yeah.
And you know, do you think people are being accurate about the trade-offs they're making? Because yes, maybe they want to walk during the weekend, but then it's going to come at the cost of efficiency, time,
Yeah.
and so on, that maybe I'm thinking about in that kind
Yeah.
of moment. So maybe it's like, I do want this, but then when it doesn't, then crap.
Yeah.
Never mind, I don't want it.
Exactly. And thank you. So the question was kind of around, you know, something might seem attractive to people, like having more green space, but then when you actually think about it further, there might be some disadvantages, like maybe it makes it harder for you to get to work. And I think that points to automobility as really a wicked problem, because these things are also intertwined, right? That we live in cities that have built up around this system, right? And so you can't, like, at the flick of a magic wand, rearrange how people are living and working and you know, shopping and eating in that space, right? And so so you do kind of have to make compromises, I think. But as we talk about different values and different things that are important to people, or maybe to different groups of people, I think that opens up a conversation to say, you know, I'm happy to make that trade-off. Also, sometimes those trade-offs are like false binaries. So in the case of Polk Street, for example, there were a lot of merchants on the street who were really worried that anything that would reduce the ease of cars moving through that street would make it more difficult for people to get to their businesses. But actually, like, only 5% of customers and 5% of people on that street actually got there by driving and parking. So a lot of people were walking because it's a very neighborhood-oriented street. Some people were biking, some people were taking transit, people were getting dropped off. I mean, it was just a place where there's not a lot of parking already. So just like the ability of people to drive and park is not much. And there's not a lot of people driving up and down the street either, because it's more like cross streets and adjacent streets. So sometimes I think if we're able to let our guard down, be a little bit more vulnerable, and say, like, okay, maybe this change doesn't threaten me in the way that I'm afraid of it. Let's like talk about it, think it through a bit more. Then that also opens new possibilities. Yeah, question.
You know, thanks for the talk, really wonderful. And you know, I'm here with some students from our sustainable built environments class. We're thinking about the design of space, and something that stuck out for me was how really inflexible automobile-oriented spaces are. You know, you showed some interventions. And this move towards sustainability means we need really high performance spaces. Doing a lot of accommodating.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think trying to pull draw the thread there. What are ways that either automobile spaces could be reinvented or broken down, or how do we deal with that that insistence that single use nature of some
Yeah.
spaces?
Yeah, thank you. The question was about for sustainability purposes, right? The need for spaces to be high performance and to have multiple uses. And I think the point of multiplicity really hits the nail on the head, as it were, because we have, you know, things like that parking lot, which I showed you, right, which is completely empty because it's only in use, you know, when the office building that's adjacent, you know, has people working in it. We have so many spaces that are only one use, and we need to think, I think, a lot more creatively about how to integrate multiple uses in a single space, but also how any use is actually multiple things at once, right? And so, you know, from a design perspective, that can be things like flexibility and modularity, but I think also in terms of our ways of thinking and imagining, it can also be, and valuing actually, right? It can be prioritizing different uses, right? Like, is it really more valuable to have this parking lot here, or would it be, you know, valuable for us to have a community garden, right? Which also points to, I think, the broader systemic issues, right? Because we're all like wage laborers and things like that. And maybe we don't have time to do the community garden, or we don't have the skills, or it just seems easier to go to the grocery store. But we're actually, for a system that is supposedly all about consumer choice, we're not providing people a lot of options, right? We're not creating options that someone can say, I want to move to a neighborhood where there's not cars that are threatening to run me over. I want to move to a neighborhood where I can be next to a community garden. I want to move to a neighborhood like this, right? We're not providing that choice. And so I think there's a lot of power dynamics at play in preventing that type of diversification and multiplicity of uses, which goes beyond just that, oh, you know, it changes hard and, you know, people like that. It's like there are clearly critical mass of people who want to do things differently, that you could carve out spaces of, you know, otherwise ways of moving around, other ways of relating to land. And so I think we need to have this bigger conversation so more people are aware of what's going on.
We might have 2 questions on Zoom.
Okay. How do we do that? Okay, great. So the first question from Christy Currens: could you speak to the strategies used to address industry standards engineering that perpetuate automobility? Assuming you have some agreement to change what's available, how can communities and professionals address the barriers found in the standard engineering practices? Yeah, so that's, there's actually a lot of layers to this question, I think. One is actually the idea of standardization in the first place, because that's already like a modernist or imperialist impulse, right, to standardize, rather than to say that we can actually have local solutions that are adapted to specific local needs, and that maybe we don't need as many standards. Of course, something like standards is required to universalize something like the automobile, that you can drive anywhere in the country. That's only possible because we have standards that make it possible to drive everywhere. So I think on a radical level, we need to think about like radical diversification, right? Thinking about in specific places in relation to their local environments, cultural contexts, histories, and local ideas. What are transportation solutions for them, right? And that maybe doesn't have to align with standards. But to the extent that there are standards, I think it's also about diversification, right? It's about maybe loosening the standards or creating alternative standards or creating like multiple options within the standards. And we do see this already in things like engineering standards in the United States, like NACTO, National Association of City Transportation Officials, has developed an alternative set of standards, right, to the federally authorized standards that are actually less around maximizing automobile speed and more about facilitating multimodal development. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. thank you for your question. The second question online says, it was interesting to hear your point about automobility and the reproduction of supremacist hierarchies, in particular, the relation between masculinity and speed. Would you like to unpack that a little further? And if possible, comment about examples you have seen in other places that do not follow this pattern. I think I'd really like to unpack this deeply, but that would kind of take us into like an hour-long lecture on feminist theory. But briefly, understanding masculinity is something that is culturally constructed. It is aligned with certain tendencies, right? Including conquest, including power, including the ability to get somewhere as quickly as possible. And one of the threads that has led to that actually was the ideal of the Greek soldier. And so this is, in Mediterranean antiquity, the Greek soldier was seen as someone who could walk, looking far ahead, not looking at the ground below their feet, and march confidently, right, with projecting the power that's invested in them, through the city-states that they're representing. And we, in many ways today, I think, are still taught to walk like Greek soldiers, because you're taught not to look at your feet as you walk, which is only possible on ground that has been paved and leveled, right? Like those Greek soldiers were walking on, streets paved with rocks, and we're walking on sidewalks that are paved with concrete. But actually, you should watch where you look, right? So I think there's also just like a bunch of norming that goes around the history of patriarchy that has developed in particular ways that is not really, does not have any need to be aligned with like a particular sex or gender, but it's been constructed in that way, and it's been globalized through modernization. I think I'll have to leave it there probably, because otherwise we're going to get into much more detail. There's a third question online. Do we have time? Yeah. Okay, good. So the last question online, I appreciate the work in establishing what we presume to be commonplace, i.e. automobility, as shored up by deriving from supremacist hierarchies, as you lay out. What type of training do you think it would take to infuse mythic, deep story research into planning, urbanism, and design? What kind of knowledge products do you see coming from such research? Also, okay, there's a side question. Let me answer the first question first. So I think that, again, it's about diversification, right? It's diversification of the types of pedagogy, types of scholarship that we have, and also valuing diverse ways of thinking. So for example, in fields like planning and design, there has been an intense emphasis over the past several decades, especially on quantitative logics and analysis, right? Which are very powerful for specific things, right? For answering certain types of questions. But that has come at the expense, I think, of a lot of other ways of thinking, right? That we could have, imagine if we had as many classes on creative imagination as we had on quantitative analysis, right? Like planning and design would work very differently. What if we had classes on diverse ways of understanding relationships between humans and nature, right? Or between humans and land? That could open our minds to lots of different ways about that. What if our classes were less standardized and were more based on local traditions, right? What if at University of Arizona, we were learning, I don't know if this exists in Kapla, but maybe we were learning more about, traditional O'odham methods of moving around, of organizing space, of constructing land. And that would give you knowledge that is then useful to apply in the Tucson area. So I think, yeah, it does have to do a lot with diversifying our values and our priorities and our courses and all of that. And the other question, is there danger in interpretive analyses of things like myths and stories in assuaging the urgency to collectively act into individualized reflection and action? So no, I don't. I actually think it's the opposite. I actually think that when we really think about myths and stories, we can understand how collective they are, right? And if you understand that everything tells stories, right? Like a sidewalk tells a story, a traffic light tells a story, you can understand that we're constantly reading these collective stories by moving through the various cities that we inhabit. And so actually focusing on those myths and stories is a way of
focusing also on the collective layer of the problem and not the extent to which, oh, I'm an individual, that doesn't apply to me, because we're actually all reading the same stories. Okay, so that's it for the online questions. One more question? Yeah.
So like that's what people who are probably how do you see us
Mhm.
top down government approach or like that's simple like
Yeah.
stuff?
Yeah. I honestly don't think it's going to be top down, because of the power structures, right? And that we see when we do have someone try to do something differently, it ends up not being nearly as revolutionary as it was promised or as it was envisioned, right? So electric cars are an example. Another example might be even like bus rapid transit in places like, Mexico City or Bogota, where most of the streets are still given up to cars, even if there are these like priority lanes for buses. So I think it has to be a little bit more organic, a little bit more grounded in local contexts and communities. And I think it's not independent from other processes of diversification and transformation, right? That are related to climate change, related to politics, related to generational shifts, related to technology that, we're interacting in different ways. So there's all of this transformation happening, and what's happening in transportation or what's going to happen in transportation, I think is also related to that. So to maybe close on an optimistic note, I think we're going to transform in ways that we can't imagine yet.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.